Tonight, you're not scrolling through ordinary history. You're sitting on a hard bench in the Lateran where the stone holds winter like a secret, and the law is about to pretend it can speak to the dead. Before you fall asleep, you'll watch a court assemble for a corpse. You'll see how politics puts on a robe and calls it procedure, and you'll follow one small, ridiculous detail paperwork, a chair, a rope that pulls an entire century of grudges into the room. Candle smoke stains the vaults. Cold air tastes of damp stone. Parchment whispers like dry leaves. Something nearby keeps time, a rope that creaks once, obedient and slow like the building is breathing for everyone. And if your breathing starts to follow it, that's perfect. Inhale 4, exhale 6. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share where and what time you're listening from, maybe that rope will remember you there. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with thunder, or war, or a heroic last speech. It begins with a throne prepared for someone who cannot breathe, and a summons written as if death still has office hours. You would think that once a person has died, their schedule clears up nicely. No more meetings, no more hearings, definitely no more trials. But in Rome, in the winter of 897, someone looked at a corpse, looked at a courtroom, and thought very calmly, we could combine these. That quiet, slightly damp idea became what we now call the Cadaver Synod, a full formal trial with candles and robes and legal formulas arranged around a pope, who was not only absent in spirit, but very convincingly present in the form of a decaying body. If you were still awake by the time we get to the part where they worry about who pays the court costs of a dead man, you are welcome to subscribe or follow or do whatever people do with channels now. But honestly, this particular pope has waited centuries already. He will not mind if you fall asleep halfway through his cross-examination. Picture a long hall in the Lateran Palace, the ceiling high enough that sound takes its time coming back. Candles smoke patiently against the vaults, leaving a faint brown memory on the stone. Benches and chairs have been dragged into cautious lines, as if the furniture has also heard a rumor that things are about to get strange and is trying to behave. Bishops arrive in slow layers like a procession of worried birds in heavy fabric. Their faces are closed, careful, carrying that specific expression people get when they know history. Might be watching, but they still have to sit on hard seats for hours. Clerks shuffle in afterward, hugging stacks of parchment that already know how this ends, because the verdict has basically been written before the corpse even enters the room. Summons have gone out in proper form, as if you can actually summon someone from beyond the grave with stationery. The language is stiff and official. The late Pope Formosus is ordered to appear and answer charges. No one writes in the margin, bring your own jaw if available, but the silence implies it. Outside the palace, Rome is busy with its usual arguments, families against families, factions against factions, the river against the banks that keep pretending they can restrain it. But inside, the city's unrest is politely translated into legal Latin. To keep everything tidy, they pretend this trial is about rules and precedents, and not about the way different groups have been using popes like particularly fancy chess pieces. It is all very dignified if you ignore the central fact that the defendant has been exhumed for the occasion. At some point, the doors open again, and the smell enters first. Then attendants follow, carrying Pope Formosus in, dressed initially in the rough practicality of a buried man. They will fix that soon enough. There is a throne set up for him facing the judge's bench, because the furniture is also participating in the illusion. The corpse is seated with the care you might use for an elderly relative who insists on attending a family wedding despite being a little unsteady, except here the unsteadiness is permanent. His papal vestments are arranged over stiffened limbs, pallium laid just so, gloves smoothed lovingly over hands that have forgotten what hands are for. Someone slides the fisherman's ring back onto a finger that will never bless anyone again, as if the jewelry is part of the evidence. The most practical problem is speech. Trials generally require it. The solution is elegantly strange. A deacon is stationed at Formosa's shoulder to answer for him in the first person. When the judge asks, "Why did you do this?" the deacon will say, "I did it." And when the question changes, he will say, "I deny it." There is a quiet understanding that no one will point out how unusual this is. In the same way that a child's game only works if everyone agrees the floor is lava, this whole proceeding functions because everyone decides consciously and collectively not to notice that the accused is incapable of indicating either guilt or boredom. Charges are laid out with the tidy precision of a kitchen shelf. Formosus is accused of perjury, of abandoning one bishopric to chase another, of illegally climbing from one sea to the next, like some kind of ecclesiastical rock climber. There are complaints that he gave sacraments when he had no right to, that he translated his authority from one place to another without the proper paperwork. To modern ears, it is a little like putting someone on trial for using the wrong shipping label. But in a world where spiritual geography and political territory are tied together like shoestrings, these details matter deeply. Each accusation is an attempt to retell the story of his career, but this time with all the verbs pointing toward should not have. As witnesses begin to speak, the scene shifts almost imperceptibly from funeral to theater. Bishops and priests recite oaths and meetings the way school children recite multiplication tables, carefully, with occasional pauses to remember whether it was 6 or 7. They describe conversations with Formosus, letters he wrote, promises he made. Every memory is trimmed to fit on a line of parchment. No one mentions the awkward pauses, the coughs, or the way people probably shuffled their feet during long speeches. The record prefers neat sentences. When relics of paperwork are brought forward, subscriptions, seals, dates, they make a small clattering sound on the table, like very tiny stones dropped into a very deep well. The case they build is not so much against Formosus the person, who is beyond being offended, but against the idea that his time as Pope ever counted. In legal Latin, they call it declaring his pontificate null from the beginning, as if you could pick up several years of history, shake them gently, and pour them back into the box unused. The deacon, still loyally doing the world's least enviable impression, says things like, "I have sinned," or "I confess," or "I deny," depending on what the script calls for. Every sentence spoken on behalf of the corpse feels like someone moving a puppet whose strings were cut too long ago. Still, the trial continues. The room has decided that procedure is more real than biology. If this is where you notice your eyes getting heavy, that is perfectly appropriate. Medieval canon law is not usually recommended as a stimulant, but if you are somehow still with us, clinging to consciousness while bishops debate jurisdiction over a man who is actively decomposing, feel free to follow this channel or tap whatever calm button your app provides. Just don't wake yourself up doing it. The court would certainly not approve of such enthusiasm. In time, the performance reaches its second act, the verdict. The decision, unsurprisingly, is that Formosus should never have been Pope at all. It is the sort of conclusion that looks devastating on paper and somewhat redundant when addressed to a corpse. But the symbolism matters. Once the words are spoken, the ceremony of subtraction begins. Attendants step forward to strip the vestments from the body, layer by careful layer, undoing in minutes what a lifetime of ambition had tried to tie tightly. The ring is pulled from the unresisting hand, not because he will need it, but because the office is being peeled away like wallpaper. Then comes the detail everyone remembers, the cutting of the blessing fingers, the 2 or 3 fingers used to trace the sign of the cross in life. In theory, this gesture cancels the sacraments he performed. It is a very literal way of saying that if you received a blessing from this particular hand, you may want to check the warranty. In practice, of course, the past does not reconfigure itself so neatly. People who are baptized by Formosus do not start unbaptizing at once, dripping water back into fonts. But for the bishops in that hall, the symbolic amputation feels necessary. If you are going to pretend that several years did not really happen, it helps to also pretend that the hand which touched them is now officially out of service. Once the legal work is done, everyone needs to decide what to do with the body. In a more ordinary scandal, the accused would be sent away to a monastery or a comfortable exile. A corpse, however, has limited options. At first, they bury him quietly again, as if closing a drawer. This might have been the end of it, if not for the lingering anxiety that follows bad decisions around like a stray dog. Rumor whispers that the River Tiber is a more final judge than any court. So not long after the trial, Formosus is dug up a second time, this time with less ceremony. They lash his body to a weight stone or other heavy object and tip him into the water. It is a solemn moment. If you ignore the practical detail that someone has to calculate how much weight you need to keep a pope from resurfacing downriver, the Tiber receives him without comment. Rivers are used to being offered things: garbage, hopes, occasional bodies, coins. This is just another item. In the current, the pontificate is reduced to cloth and bone and dragged through the water. On the banks, factions adjust themselves. The party that orchestrated the Cadaver Synod declares victory and goes home to rehearse conversations about responsibility into the mirror. People who disliked Formosus feel vindicated. People who liked him, or at least preferred him to the alternatives, feel quietly ill. Everyone, however, must still pay rent and remember to buy bread. Even in the shadow of a famously strange trial, daily life continues to step around puddles and complain about the weather. But Rome, like any city, has a limited attention span for one narrative. Within months, the political wind shifts. Pope Stephen VI, who presided over the trial with a kind of hectic certainty, finds his own chair wobbling. The same factions that lifted him now decide he is more trouble than he is worth. The pendulum swings with a creaking sound. Stephen is imprisoned, then dies in confinement, which feels grimly familiar in a city where leadership and danger are close neighbors. A new pope steps in, then another, and another. One of them decides that perhaps condemning a corpse was not the church's most timeless idea. So they quietly rehabilitate Formosus, or at least loosen the knots tied around his memory. Some stories say that Formosus's body is eventually recovered from the river, that he is reburied more respectfully, that his relics even work a few miracles. Whether every detail is true is less important than the mood it creates. History untying a knot it had tied too tightly, like someone redoing a shoelace after tripping on it in public. Synods meet to annul the earlier synod, then later synods reconsider those annulments. Decrees are repealed, then reinterpreted, then filed away carefully behind other, less embarrassing documents. On the shelves of the papal archives, the Cadaver Synod gradually becomes less a policy and more a cautionary tale about what happens when law is asked to do too much theater. For historians, the real fascination comes later, when they sit down with all this paperwork and try to read through the layers of anxiety. Decrees about whether Formosus was valid or invalid as pope are written, crossed out, written again. Margins accumulate tiny notes in later hands, clarifications, corrections, the medieval equivalent of actually what they meant here was. As you read, you can almost hear different generations murmuring over each other. One scribe is concerned about canon law. Another worries about political alliances. A third is simply irritated that the page is running out of space. The result is a kind of palimpsest of concern. From a sleepy distance, what stands out is how much effort went into adjusting a single man's status after his death. If you charted the decisions on a timeline, the line would look like a piece of thread pulled one way, then another, then cut, then knotted back together again. First, Formosus is a legitimate pope, then he is not, then he is again, at least partially. Then future councils debate whether the original verdict should count for anything at all. It would be amusing if it were not also strangely human to see people trying to make reality match whichever paperwork is most convenient at a given moment. Modern readers tend to ask whether the Cadaver Synod tells us something profound about the medieval church. It does, in a way. It shows us how seriously they took the idea that rituals and offices were real structures, not just costumes. If a man who had been pope was later declared never to have been pope, what happened to everything he signed? To the bishops he consecrated, the ordinations he performed, the marriages he witnessed? You can feel the archival panic creeping in. It is like discovering that the manager who signed all your department as contracts technically never held the job. Do the chairs you bought have to go back? Do the bills uncharge? Yet, in another sense, the Cadaver Synod is almost comfortingly bureaucratic. For all the sensational detail of a corpse on a throne, most of the episode is about paperwork. Who signed what, which canon applies, whether the synod outranks that one. Even when people are throwing a dead pope into a river, they're doing it to support a particular interpretation of church law. The drama feels almost accidental, a side effect of their dedication to tidy categories. They want the list of popes to be clean, with no doubtful names. They want the record to read as if every transition was smooth and justified. The universe, sadly, is not arranged for a neat list. If you stayed awake to the end, you now know that medieval Rome once held a full court session for a man who could not possibly object, complete with legal formulas, robes, and the careful trimming of fingers. You have seen bishops reciting rules to a corpse as though they were explaining office policy to someone who missed the training day. You have watched, from a safe and very modern distance, as a city tried to use law and ritual to undo a stretch of time it no longer liked. And you have seen how, in the long run, the river, the archives, and the patient boredom of historians all outlasted the anger that started it. Somewhere beyond the edge of this story, candles are still quietly guttering in the imagined hall. The rope that once held Formosus upright on his throne hangs slack now, remembering the weight without needing to say anything about it. The river flows on, thinking no particular thoughts about popes or verdicts. Shelves in the Vatican still hold copies of the decrees, the rescissions of rescissions, each on its own piece of paper that rustles softly when moved. If you open them, Latin letters line up with tremendous seriousness to debate a decision that everyone involved has long since outlived. So you can let your thoughts wander along those shelves for a while longer, if you like, or you can let them blur at the edges. The hall quiets, the bishop's robes stop rustling. The deacon's voice, so patiently borrowed by a man who could not speak, falls silent at last. What remains is simply the idea that even the most spectacular events eventually become lines in a chronicle, and then footnotes, and then late night. Murmurs on a channel whose whole purpose is to make you too drowsy to finish the sentence. The trial continues, somewhere in the background of history, but you do not have to stay for the closing arguments. You can let the candles burn down on their own and drift away before anyone asks you to testify. You might not think a single slightly dented bell hanging over a town gate could decide when everyone had to be in bed, but for a few 100 years in medieval and early modern Europe, that was more or less the plan. The bell did not ring for glory or danger. It rang for bedtime. It rang for put the fire out and stop selling onions, and yes, the tavern really is closing, this time we mean it. Whole towns agreed to let a bit of bronze hanging on a rope tell them when the day was over. It was like handing your phone to the local council and letting them set everyone's bedtime alarm at once. Except the phone weighed several hundred kilos and occasionally cracked in cold weather. Somewhere near the center of town, or very slightly off to one side because the tower was built when no one was looking, the curfew bell hung in its wooden frame. During the day, it was just part of the skyline, a small lump of metal outlined against the sky, collecting dust and pigeon opinions. Then, at the approved hour, often around 8 or 9 in the evening, depending on the season, and whoever had last adjusted the ordinances, it came to life. The bell ringer, who had the glamorous job of being the human snooze button of the community, trudged up the stairs with a lantern. He checked the mechanism, checked the rope, checked his own patience, and then started the steady, unhurried rhythm that meant, "That's it, everyone. We're done here." This was not the dramatic, clanging alarm bell you might imagine from movies. The curfew bell's job was not to panic anyone. Its work was the opposite, to flatten the day, iron out the last wrinkles of commerce and conversation, and gently press everything into the quiet of night. So the ringing was measured. A set number of strokes, often specified with surprising precision in town records. 12 strokes in some places, 20 in others, or 3 short peals, followed by a long one in a town that liked to flourish. If you re still awake by the time we get to the part where different municipalities argue about exactly how long the bell must ring for the command, to count you are free to subscribe, follow, or simply think a kind thought about bells. But really, you could just let the sound in your mind fade and call that compliance. The word curfew itself comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire, which was less about romance and more about preventing towns from burning down in the middle of the night because someone's hearth decided to resume negotiations with a stray log. At the signal, people were supposed to rake the embers of their open fires under a layer of ash or cover them with a metal lid. Households that had moved up in the world might own an actual curfew, a domed cover you could place over the coals, like tucking the fire in under a small, extremely heat-proof blanket. City authorities worried about chimneys the way modern officials worry about wiring codes. A single spark on a windy night could turn timber walls into a very unwanted communal bonfire. Rules grew up around that nightly ringing like ivy clings to a wall. Ordinances specified what had to stop when the bell sounded. Markets closed. Taverns stopped serving, at least in theory. Public games wrapped up, sometimes in mid-roll of the dice. The town watch began its rounds with more authority. If the bell had spoken, you were officially out of time. In some places, the regulations went into comical detail. No one was to be found in the streets with lighted torches after the 3rd stroke. No one was to carry straw through the lanes once the bell began. No cooking, no blacksmithing, no loud singing by apprentices who were certain they could hit that note this time. Just one more try, master. There were fines, naturally. Medieval city councils believed that nothing helped a person understand the beauty of safety like the threat of losing small amounts of money. So if you were caught keeping your hearth blazing cheerfully after the bell, you might pay a modest sum, recorded carefully in the town accounts right next to payments for repairing bridge planks and buying new buckets. It was not a terrifying punishment. It was more like the historical version of getting a parking ticket for leaving your carriage in the wrong alley of the night. Some places even had a scale of penalties, increasing if you ignored the bell repeatedly, as if the city fathers suspected that once you had defied bedtime 3 times, you might be capable of anything. The bell did not only talk to fire, it also had opinions about where you were allowed to be. In many towns, no one but the night watch and a few approved travelers were supposed to be on the street after curfew. The idea was simple. Fewer people outside meant fewer crimes, fewer brawls, and fewer witnesses tripping over open drains. An honest citizen, they imagined, would prefer to be at home, arms folded politely, perhaps already asleep upright on a bench. Anyone abroad after hours, especially if carrying something suspiciously heavy or suspiciously sharp, could be invited to explain themselves to the city guard in tones that suggested this was not entirely a social call. Of course, reality was more flexible than the regulations. People bent the curfew the way people bend all collective rules meant to organize the fun out of life. Tavern owners learned to pour very quickly as the final strokes approached. Late customers developed an ability to walk home in a posture that said, "I definitely left before the bell. I am simply trapped in a time zone of my own." Bakers, who needed to be up at absurd hours to prepare bread for morning, obtained exemptions, or learned to move quietly, shuffling between ovens and kneading troughs like flour-dusted ghosts. The bell would ring, the town would sigh, and then in little pockets behind shutters, life went on, just not loudly enough to bother the magistrate's sleep. Merchants and officials had their own special relationship with curfew. Documents from some cities show council meetings scheduled with fussy care to finish before the bell, as if even politics had to respect bedtime. The clerk would note that the assembly adjourned before the ringing of curfew, which is a polite way of saying they managed not to argue past dark that day. On other evenings, when discussions ran long and tempers warm, it must have been interesting to hear the bell start up in the middle of a heated speech about tax policy. One imagines a pause, a collective glance upward, and then a decision, either to ignore it and risk giving the watch ideas, or to postpone further indignation until tomorrow morning. Different towns had different curfew personalities. In some places, the bell rang from the main church tower, its sound carrying out over rooftops, and in nearby fields, reminding even late-working farmers that the town had declared the day done. In others, a smaller tower or gatehouse claimed the honor. A few communities held onto the custom long after their neighbors had let it slip. A traveler might ride from one city where the bell no longer sounded into another where 8 o'clock still meant a solemn toll and the closing of shutters. It must have felt like crossing between time zones built not from longitude, but from local tolerance for evening leisure. Seasonal adjustments added another layer of quiet absurdity. In summer, with long light and warm air, authorities sometimes allowed a later bell, knowing that people would ignore an early one. In winter, when darkness came sneaking in at mid-afternoon, curfew might ring while shopkeepers were still in the middle of thinking about folding their cloth. Regulations wrestled with this problem by providing flexible schedules, which had to be written, amended, and posted. Somewhere on a town wall, a small notice explained that from St. Michael's Day to Easter, the bell would signal at 1 hour, and from Easter to Michaelmas at another. If you have ever sat through a meeting about changing office hours, you already understand the energy in those discussions. There was also the question of travelers who arrived after hours, dusty and hopeful, only to find the gates closed, and the bell already having expressed its opinion on the matter. Some cities allowed late arrivals and after inspection and a modest fee, which is basically the medieval version of surge pricing. Others were stricter, leaving wanderers to decide between sleeping just outside the walls, presumably with their back against a barrel and their cloak pulled tight, or finding a sympathetic guard who believed their story about being delayed by a broken cartwheel, a limping mule, or time itself. Over the centuries, curfew bells collected stories the way their towers collected soot. Chroniclers occasionally mention them in passing, the bell that failed to ring on a night when something disastrous happened, the bell that rang unexpectedly at noon because the ringer misheard the hour and confused the entire town, the bell whose rope snapped mid-peal, which someone almost certainly interpreted as an omen about taxes. These small incidents were noted, commented on in alehouses, and then folded back into the general hum of life, like glitches in a very slow, very repetitive soundtrack. As states grew stronger and cities more confident, the bell's authority began to thin out around the edges. Fire regulations found new allies in chimney design and insurance policies. Nightlife, in the modern sense, arrived, first tentatively and then with more conviction, bringing with it coffee houses, theaters, and the revolutionary notion that some people might wish to talk with each other after dark without being suspected of plotting treason. In some towns, the curfew bell changed jobs. Instead of ordering people indoors, it became a signal for something more symbolic, the closing of the day, but without legal teeth. It was a gentle suggestion, not a command. By the 19th century in many places, the curfew bell had become a kind of historical habit. It rang because it had always rung. Children might be told with more affection than fear, that the bell meant it was time for bed. Older residents remembered when shopkeepers took it more seriously. The sound drifted over gas lamps and cobblestones now, instead of open hearths and straw-covered floors. It was still the same bell, perhaps, with the same hairline crack running down the side, but the world around it had stopped obediently folding itself up at the first stroke. In a few towns, the bell maintained a more stubborn hold. Ordinances technically remained in force. Fines could still be levied on anyone foolish, enough to keep a dangerous blaze roaring merrily under a thatched roof after the hour. In practice, enforcement depended on mood. If the local constable preferred a quiet walk, he might ignore the sliver of light under certain doors. If he was feeling particularly conscientious, he might knock, politely remind the occupants of the regulations, and admire the fire cover, which by then was as much a piece of nostalgia as a tool. Either way, the bell's voice softened. It became part of the soundscape, like dogs or distant carts, something you noticed if you listened but could easily let blur into the background of your thoughts. For modern ears, used to alarms that beep and buzz and repeat until tapped, the curfew bell seems almost considerate. It did not shriek. It did not flash. It simply marked a boundary between one part of the day and another, between the time when the town was a marketplace and the time when it was a collection of sleeping rooms, creaking timber and gently smoking chimneys. It is oddly soothing to imagine a whole community wrapped in that sound, hearing it drift over rooftops and through open windows, each person making a few last adjustments, banking the fire, closing the shutters, muttering the medieval equivalent of I'll deal with that tomorrow, and then letting the night close in. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the pattern. The bell beginning with a slow, deliberate stroke, the echo rolling out over uneven streets, the gap between each note giving people time to think, one more log, one more word, one more sip. Then the final ring. Silence settles like dust. The tower stands watch, its job done until morning. Somewhere a clerk has already written down, in neat script, that the bell rang at the appointed hour, as if the universe needed that fact on file. And somewhere else, perhaps in a quiet room not so different from yours, someone is already half asleep, the fading memory of that sound tying the day into a small, manageable bundle. The laws, the fines, the official phrases about covering fires and clearing streets have peeled away with time. What remains is just a sleepy bell tolling in your imagination, reminding you that it is perfectly acceptable, even historically respectable, to let the day end here and drift slowly, comfortably, into the kind of silence no ordinance has ever managed to regulate. You might not expect a rough plank of wood nailed to the side of a bridge, covered in tiny knife marks and the occasional thumbprint, to be one of the most important financial documents in a medieval town, but it was. Long before spreadsheets and traffic cameras, cities tried to keep track of who crossed their bridges using bits of wood, bits of string, and the unhurried attention of a person whose entire job was to watch carts go by. If that already sounds sleep-inducing, you're in exactly the right place. The idea was simple. If you wanted to bring goods into town, you had to cross the bridge. If you crossed the bridge, you had to pay. Not necessarily much, often just a few coins or a measured scoop of grain, or in one persistent example, a single egg per flock of chickens, but enough that the town council began to see the bridge as a kind of slow, reliable money fountain. To make sure every wagon, mule, and occasionally baffled goose was counted, the authorities appointed a bridge warden. He sat in a little hut at one end, with a bench, a tally stick, and a view of the river that was probably beautiful for the first week, and then became just background. If you were still awake by the time we get to the clause about how to charge. For a cart that only half crossed the bridge, you're welcome to subscribe, follow, or simply imagine sliding a small coin across a wooden counter. But there's really no need to make any sudden movements. The tally stick was an elegant solution for a world that did not entirely trust ink, paper, or human memory. When a cart rolled up, wheels squeaking, driver muttering, something in the back rustling faintly, the warden would ask what was being carried. There were rules for this. The town's toll ordinance might say, so much for a load of timber, so much for a barrel of wine, so much for miscellaneous goods, which was the polite way of saying whatever else you've piled on there. The warden would collect the due amount and then make a small notch on the stick. Different kinds of notches meant different tolls. A shallow cut for a pedestrian, a deeper one for a cart, a paired notch for livestock. Over the course of the day, the wood filled up with marks, a quiet forest of tiny decisions about how much a sack of onions was worth to the city treasury. At the end of the week, or the end of the accounting period, the warden would bring the stick to the town hall. There, under the thoughtful gaze of a clerk with ink-stained fingers, the tally stick was split lengthwise with a careful stroke. Because the notches went all the way through, each half carried the same pattern. One half stayed with the town, the other with the bridge office. When the two were matched, they formed a complete record like an early wooden form of double-entry bookkeeping. It is oddly comforting to imagine two serious people in wool tunics leaning over a table, sliding bits of wood together to make sure the notches aligned up. Medieval equivalent of reconciling columns in a spreadsheet cell by cell, except that the spreadsheet smelled of sap and river mist. Bridge toll schedules could be surprisingly detailed. Some survive in town archives, carefully copied into books with titles like On the Order and Customs of the Bridge. They explain, with heroic patience, exactly what to charge for every imaginable user. A man on foot might pay one rate, a man on horseback slightly more, a man on horseback leading a second horse somewhere in between. Carts drawn by one horse were one category. Those drawn by two horses, another. Those drawn by oxen, yet another, since oxen were slow but could pull impressive amounts of everything. There were special rates for herds of pigs, which moved in groups and, from the tone of some regulations, did not always move in the desired direction on the first attempt. Somewhere a council had sat and argued gently about whether 20 sheep should count as one flock or two, and how exactly to charge for a wagon that crossed the bridge empty but clearly planned to come back full. Then there were exemptions, the small print that kept the whole system from collapsing under its own seriousness. Clergy might pass toll-free because the church was above such matters, at least in theory. Messengers of the prince, if carrying sealed letters, went through without paying because it was best not to delay letters that could contain orders about armies. Local peasants bringing their own produce to the weekly market sometimes paid less, a nod to the fact that without them the market would be an echoing, vegetable-free expanse. Over time, more and more groups tried to claim exemption. University scholars argued that their books should pass for free, on the grounds that knowledge was a kind of food for the mind. The toll clerks listened, nodded politely, and then either agreed or quietly wrote one card of books in the margin with the appropriate notch. Of course, no system that depends on people watching other people is ever entirely free of improvisation. Bridge wardens were supposed to be honest, solemn, and indifferent to small temptations. Many were, but it was extremely easy on a chilly morning when the fog curled over the water and the toll hut smelled of damp wool for a warden to let a friend's car pass with a lighter charge, or to forget to make a notch for an especially unmemorable load of apples. Town councils tried to compensate with periodic inspections to surprise visits, and the occasional replacement of a warden who seemed to live in suspiciously improved comfort. One can imagine the town's auditors approaching the bridge slowly, trying not to look like auditors, while the current warden, noticing them, suddenly develops a new level of enthusiasm for making very clear, audible notches in the stick. Then there were the disputes, little dramas that never reached the chroniclers but must have played out daily. A driver insists that his barrels are mostly empty. The warden taps one and hears the dull slosh that says otherwise. A shepherd claims that several of his sheep are still lambs and should be counted at a reduced rate. The sheep, unhelpfully, refused to bleed on cue. Occasionally, whole groups of travelers arrived together, a caravan of merchants, a troupe of performers, a group of pilgrims in matching badges. Sorting out who owed what fee and who might be excused in the name of piety or entertainment turned the toll hut into a small, temporary theater of negotiation. All of it, in the end, resolved into notches on wood and a little pile of coins that someone would have to count slowly twice once evening came. Despite all this activity, the bridge itself did not hurry. Stone arches rose patiently over the water, bearing carts, feet, and occasional runaway poultry. Tolls collected in summer paid for repairing ice damage in winter. When a flood carried off a portion of the structure, the town minutes record long discussions about raising tolls slightly or adding a special temporary charge on especially heavy loads. There is something deeply sleepy about those debates. Respectable men in layered clothing arguing for hours about whether one extra denarius on a wagon of firewood would be tolerated by the citizens while the river outside continued flowing without any opinion whatsoever. Sometimes the toll did more than pay for stones. In a few towns, it funded a chapel built at the bridgehead where travelers could pause to pray for safe passage or perhaps for patience with the toll system. Elsewhere, the money supported a hospital or a poorhouse or the maintenance of a fountain. Toll rolls list these allocations in meek, compact script. So much to the bridge, so much to the lamp oil fund, so much to paying the man who cleans the mud from the steps. It is an entire civic budget written in numbers that rarely reach above 3 figures, yet taken no less seriously for their smallness. As centuries passed, the practice evolved. Some bridges were farmed out. A private individual or a consortium paid the city a lump sum in advance for the right to collect tolls for a period of years. In theory, this guaranteed the town its revenue without worrying about daily fluctuations. In practice, it meant that the new toll farmer was extremely interested in counting every possible crossing because any extra was his profit. Travelers might notice a sudden, enthusiastic precision at the hut. Rates that had once been rounded kindly down were now rounded carefully up. New signs appeared, nailed to posts, explaining the tariff in firmer language. Somewhere, a warden sighed and added, "working for a consortium," to his internal job description. Eventually, ideas about free movement and public roads began to nibble away at this elaborate world of fees. Reformers argued that trade flowed better without small obstacles. Bridges, they said, should be supported by general taxes instead of per-cart contributions. Little by little, tolls were abolished or reduced. Some cities celebrated by parading through the gates and across the bridge without paying, a stunt that must have confused the few remaining wardens, who watched their job vanish under a wave of civic enthusiasm and unpaid pigs. Toll houses became storage sheds or kiosks, or simply collapsed after being left unused, their tally sticks abandoned in cupboards until curious archivists discovered them again centuries later. What remains now, in museum drawers and archive boxes, are those sticks, split and matched, their notches still visible. They look unimpressive, bits of wood, some cracked, some darkened with age. But if you run your fingers along the grooves, you are tracing thousands of individual moments when the world slowed down long enough to be counted. A card arrived. A voice asked what was inside. A coin changed hands. A mark was cut. Each notch is a small pause in someone's day. A tiny decision that felt important for about 3 seconds and then dissolved into routine. Together, they form a long, quiet record of movement, of people and goods, of seasons, of markets waxing and waning. There is something oddly peaceful about imagining those days. The bridge, the river, the steady roll of wheels. The warden in his hut, noticing the weather more than he notices arguments about international trade. The script of his life is simple: watch, ask, count, mark, repeat. Occasionally, something unusual arrives at traveling menagerie. a wagon full of bells, a nobleman with too many servants, but even these are just slightly more elaborate units to be notched. The drama is small, the stakes are local, and the rhythm is as steady as the plot of Hooves on Planks. If you let your mind follow that rhythm, cart, step, question, coin, notch, you can almost feel your own thoughts slowing to match it. The bridge does not mind if a few coins were miscounted, if a few sheep slipped by uncharged, if one or two tally sticks were left half full when a new warden took over. The river below keeps flowing, uninterested in tariffs. The stone arches stand through fog and sun, carrying their lines of traffic until the day someone decides that tolls are old-fashioned and removes the hut altogether. By then, the habit of crossing has become so automatic that people no longer notice. They are doing something that used to require negotiations and notches. They simply walk or drive or cycle across, thinking of other things entirely. The bridge that once demanded a tiny act of attention from everyone who used it has become invisible. All that counting has faded into silence. And somewhere in a quiet room lined with shelves, a historian bends over a tally stick, reading the notches like an unusually monotonous story. They decipher how many carts of grain crossed in a week, how many herds of pigs, how many anonymous travelers on foot. Their notes fill a careful page. Outside, the modern city hums with traffic nobody is individually counting. Inside, the bridge of long ago continues its slow work of putting people to sleep, one notch at a time, as the steady crossing of hooves and footsteps turns softly into the even rhythm of your own breathing. You might not think that the most contested piece of real estate in a medieval town was a wooden bench inside a chilly stone church. Not the mill, not the market stall, not the defensive tower, but a particular stretch of wood where you could sit, or kneel, or at least lean in a manner that suggested sitting. Yet for centuries, people argued very quietly and sometimes very loudly about who belonged on which bench, in which row, and how far from the door that position should be. It is, in a gentle way, the story of how Europe invented the seating chart, one splinter at a time. Imagine the first scene. It is Sunday, or whatever passes for Sunday in the local calendar. The bell rings, not very melodically, but insistently enough to wake up most people who were still bargaining with their pillows. The villagers drift toward the church, wrapped in cloaks, thinking about breakfast or the weather or whether the thatch needs patching again. Inside, the building is mostly open stone space. Early churches did not come furnished. There might be a few stone benches built into the walls, convenient for the elderly, the tired, or the speculative theologian who enjoys leaning dramatically. Everyone else stands. Standing for an hour, perhaps more, while the service goes on in Latin that most cannot follow, is very good for circulation, but not particularly kind to knees. After a while, someone brings a stool. Maybe it is an older parishioner with a bad leg. Maybe a richer villager decides they are done pretending to be comfortable. Either way, a small, three-legged piece of private furniture enters the shared holy space. This is a tiny revolution. The stool is set down, the user sits, and everyone around notices. Some are impressed, some mildly scandalized, and some are simply envious. The worship continues, but now there is a new question hovering in the incense haze. Is sitting in church allowed? More importantly, is it allowed for me? If you are somehow still awake by the time we reach the part where we calculate pew rent in pennies per elbow, you may, if you like, subscribe or follow, or simply promise to think kindly toward your own chair. There is, however, absolutely no pressure. In the long tradition of church seating, doing nothing has always been an extremely popular option. The stool problem spreads. Others bring stools or simple benches. Some lean long planks against the walls, creating communal perches. The priest, who has his own special chair in the sanctuary, is used to the idea that chairs mean status. The more furniture shows up, the more that status starts to leak into the congregation. Who sits closer to the front? Who sits nearer the pulpit? Who ends up close to the drafty door and the occasional dog? Chaplains and local lords begin to notice that people cluster according to rank, occupation, and general willingness to arrive early. In some places, unwritten customs develop, men on one side, women on the other, unmarried young people clustered at the back, the town council dignified in the front row, in case divine judgment needs to check the minutes. The moment when this informal arrangement becomes an official seating plan usually arrives in a wonderfully petty way. A visiting dignitary shows up, or a notable wedding takes place, or two families decide at the same time that they have earned the right to sit in the same desirable spot. For one famous case in England, the dispute concerned the second seat from the chancel door on the south side, which sounds like the sort of phrase you would only use after thinking about it for several sleepless nights. Someone complains. Someone else refuses to move. Eventually, the priest realizes that if this continues, half the village will be praying while staring pointedly at the backs of the other half. So the records show a new kind of document, seating decrees. Town councils and vestries draw up lists of who is entitled to sit where. They use phrases with a calm, bureaucratic energy, assigning benches according to rank, charity, and customary occupation. In practice, this means that people with land and titles tend to sit toward the front, while those who make things with their hands gradually retreat toward the back and the side aisles. Widows are given specific places. Visiting strangers are gently herded to whatever spare plank exists next to a pillar. Children are often packed together like a small wiggling carpet near the nave, where a single adult can glare at them all at once. Once the mapping begins, the furniture changes. Churches install fixed pews-long wooden benches with backs attached to the floor. This feels permanent, reassuring, and in cold weather, slightly warmer. It also means that moving to a better seat is no longer as simple as arriving earlier. The pew is now part of the architecture and, by extension, part of your family's identity. Some families carve their names or coats of arms into the end panels. Others just develop a collective, unspoken claim. This is our pew. We sit here. We have always sat here. Historical evidence suggests that always in this context often means since about 3 years ago. But memory is a flexible thing, especially when comfort is involved. With fixed pews come more intricate rules. Many parishes begin charging a small fee for the privilege of occupying a particular seat. These are pew rents, and they very quickly evolve into a whole economic system. You can rent by the year, by the half year, sometimes by the quarter. The seat is yours for ordinary Sundays, major feasts, and possibly funerals, depending on the fine print. If you fail to pay, your family may find itself demoted to a less prestigious bench, which is embarrassing, but also provides the community with something new to talk about quietly during the sermon. Some parishes keep carefully written pew books, listing each seat, the name of the person who rents it, the amount paid, and how much is currently in arrears. Reading those books feels a bit like scrolling through a very slow, handwritten social media feed. You can watch families move upward in the world as they shift toward the front over the years. You can see when a lineage disappears from the records, its seat reallocated to someone new. You can tell which seats are considered highly desirable. They are rented immediately and rarely appear as vacant. There are even cases where families bequeath their pew rights and wills, ensuring that their descendants could continue to sit in the same patch of polished wood for generations. Of course, not everyone could afford these little rectangles of comfort and prestige. Poorer parishioners were often assigned to free seats, usually at the back or in galleries built high along the nave walls. These spaces were technically part of the same church, but physically distinct, with their own entrances and their own drafts. In some towns, servants sat behind their masters, or in side aisles where they could be present but not particularly visible. The seating arrangement became a quiet map of local hierarchy, drawn not on paper but in bodies and benches. Occasionally, all this order collided with human personality. There's a delightful, if slightly melancholy, genre of court case in which someone sues someone else over a seat. The documents are full of phrases like, did unlawfully and with great presumption seat himself, or refused to vacate the pew allocated to the plaintiff as family since time immemorial. Time immemorial, upon closer inspection, often turns out to be about 50 years, which for that particular community probably felt like forever. Witnesses are called to testify about who sat where at which festival decades ago. One can picture elderly parishioners summoned to court, squinting thoughtfully and saying things like, well, on the feast of St. Martin in the year when the old bell cracked, I remember that the bakers were in the fourth seat because my cousin stood behind them and complained about their hats. In some regions, the seating plan interacted with elaborate ideas about gender. Men and women sat on different sides of the central aisle, or in different sections entirely. Married women might have their own row, unmarried women another. Young men were sometimes relegated to the back or to the gallery, on the theory that distance from the pulpit might somehow calm their energies. It did not, but it did give them an excellent vantage point for observing the entire congregation and developing opinions about everyone's hats. The physical layout of the church thus reinforced the social one, carving invisible lines between groups that all shared the same hymns, but not exactly the same view. Over time, seating became tangled with clothing. If you knew you were going to be visible in a front pew, you might invest in a slightly finer cloak or a more enthusiastic collar. In some places, women in certain seats were expected to wear distinctive headgear or display particular badges of office. The church began to resemble a quiet, extremely repetitive fashion show, in which the runway never moved and the outfits changed only slowly from year to year. Small variations took on meaning, a new color, a different cut, an extra ribbon. All of it helped the community know where everyone fit, whether or not anyone had consciously agreed on the rules. The architecture kept up in its own measured way. Pews acquired doors, turning rows into little wooden boxes. In a few traditions, families brought their own cushions or small stoves to keep feet warm during long services. Some pews gained small shelves for books or hooks for hats. There are delightful reports of small children being allowed to sleep on the bench during especially lengthy sermons, effectively discovering the pew's secret secondary function as a public nap capsule. Once or twice, someone complains in the record about a pew being used to store baskets, cloaks, or even the occasional chicken, proving that the line between sacred space and convenient shelf has always been a bit blurry. The existence of pew rents and reserved seating might seem to contradict the idea of a church as a place where all are equal. Reformers noticed this too. In the 18th and 19th centuries, various movements argued for the abolition of pew rents, insisting that churches should be free and open. They told stories of poor worshippers who felt shut out by elaborate box pews, or of newcomers who did not know where they were allowed to sit and therefore stayed away. In some cities, new churches were built with open benches and no reserved spaces at all, a radical innovation that led inevitably to the return of the old quiet custom. You still sat in the same place every week. You just did so without a receipt. Where pew rents persisted, they were sometimes listed in printed tables, a kind of subscription plan for spiritual ergonomics. Front row seats cost more, side aisles slightly less, back rows least of all. Galleries came at a discount, though they did provide a certain acoustic advantage if the choir was lively. The records show that even small increases in rent could prompt careful debate. Vestry minutes from one parish painstakingly discuss whether an extra penny per seat might be inconvenient. To the poorer sort, a phrase that suggests both genuine concern and a mild worry about attendance numbers. Another parish experimented with a voluntary contribution system, then quietly returned to fixed rents after discovering that voluntariness mostly produced drafty pews and unbalanced budgets. From a modern perspective, all of this can seem faintly absurd. We live in a world where we reserve seats with a few taps on a screen, watch numbered rows light up on airplanes and trains, and accept that concert tickets cost more if they are closer to the stage. The idea of assigning seats in church feels, at once, oddly familiar and slightly out of tune. Yet the principles are much the same: proximity, visibility, and the subtle comfort of knowing that no one will ask you to move halfway through the event. A medieval villager who spent years defending the third bench from the front on the north side would probably understand perfectly the frustration of finding a stranger in your usual spot on the bus. Even after official seating systems faded, the habits remained. Many people, perhaps including you, have a preferred seat in their usual gathering spaces. A particular row in a classroom, a specific corner in a cafe, a chair that feels somehow wrong if anyone else uses it, even though, strictly speaking, the law does not recognize personal sovereignty over that square meter of upholstery. This quiet attachment is the distant echo of all those centuries when where you sat in church told the community who you were, whom you belonged with, and how much you were expected to contribute to the roof repairs. If you picture now a typical Sunday in one of those carefully arranged churches, the scene is remarkably gentle. The bell has rung. People arrive and move, almost automatically, to their accustomed places. A stranger is shown to a spare seat. A child wriggles under a pew door and is coaxed back with a look. The service unfolds, words and music rising and falling, while the seating plan holds everyone in a kind of quiet grid. From above, it might look like an orderly garden of heads and shoulders, each plant in its assigned bed. From ground level, it is simply where you stand or sit or kneel, just as you did last week, and perhaps will again next week, without thinking about how many small negotiations made those patterns possible. The documents that preserve these arrangements are thin, calm things, faded ink on paper, a few lines about who should sit afore the pulpit and who in the hindmost forms. They do not shout. They do not mark great battles or glorious treaties. They simply record a community's attempt to make shared space slightly more comfortable, slightly more orderly, and occasionally slightly more flattering to the people who wrote the rules. Read slowly. They have the same effect as sitting in a familiar pew during a long sermon. Your mind wanders pleasantly, drifting between names and numbers and imagined hats, until the edges of the scene blur and you almost forget what prompted you to sit down in the first place. Somewhere in an archive, a historian turns those pages, tracing the names, reconstructing who sat where. Outside, the world hurries. Chairs are rearranged for meetings and events, and few people argue about whether the Baker family truly owns the third bench from the front. Inside the records, however, the old seating plan remains, fixed, quiet, endlessly patient. It is always Sunday, the bell is always about to ring, and the same families are always on their way to the same pieces of polished wood. In that frozen moment, nothing urgent happens at all. Only the slow choreography of people finding their places, settling into them with small sighs, and waiting for something to begin, or perhaps just as softly, for their thoughts to drift away into sleep. You might not expect something as small as the position of a clock hand to decide when entire towns woke up, prayed, argued, baked bread, closed shop, and quietly went to sleep. Yet for several centuries, the most powerful negotiator in a European town was not the mayor, nor the priest, nor even the tax collector. It was a piece of metal slowly turning over a painted dial, announcing that it was, for example, about a quarter before something or other, which everyone pretended to understand. The long, quiet history of public clocks is basically humanity's extended attempt to agree on what now means, while also making sure the bell doesn't fall on anyone. If you stay awake long enough for us to reach the thrilling topic of municipal regulations on clock-winding schedules, you are welcome to follow, subscribe, or simply feel extra affectionate toward your own alarm clock tomorrow. But honestly, by that point, your brain may be so gently saturated in timekeeping trivia that the only thing you'll subscribe to is 8 hours of sleep. Our story begins, as many mildly dull stories do, with monasteries. Medieval monasteries were obsessed with time in a very practical way. The day was divided into canonical hours, each with Latin names that sounded impressive and slightly vague. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, non, vespers, compline. Monks were supposed to pray at these times, work in between, and not accidentally sleep through all of them. In the early days, this required a timekeeper monk who had the unenviable job of waking up in the dark and deciding whether it felt like 3 a.m. Yet, various solutions appeared. There were water clocks that dripped at a more or less predictable rate, sand glasses that needed turning, and sundials that refused to cooperate on cloudy days, which in Northern Europe is most of them. Some communities used candle clocks, wax candles marked with lines, each line representing a set number of minutes. As the candle burned, the time passed. This worked quite well until someone knocked the candle, or wax was of particularly enthusiastic quality, and burned, faster causing every event in the monastery to happen 15 minutes early, which might not sound serious. Now, that would have been cosmically inappropriate before breakfast. The desire to automate this process led, gradually, toward mechanical clocks, devices with gears, weights, and escapements that could tick in something resembling a regular pattern. The earliest of these large mechanical clocks appear in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. They were expensive, impressive, and absolutely enormous. You could not casually put one on a bedside table, so towns did the logical thing. They installed them in towers where everyone could see the dial and hear the bell, assuming you were within a reasonable distance and not, for example, hiding behind a very determined pig. These early tower clocks rarely bothered with minutes. The concept of caring about the exact minute was still a sparkle barely visible on the horizon of human anxiety. Hours were plenty. The clock struck 1 or 2 or 6, and you roughly calibrated your sense of about now-ish against it. Merchants opened their shops when the bell said it was time. Bakers used it to time their batches, at least in theory. Town councils scheduled their meetings with the respectable imprecision of after the bell of prime. If you traveled from one town to another, you accepted that their clock might disagree with your town's clock by half an hour or more, and nobody felt the need to hold an international conference about it. Inside those towers, the mechanisms looked like metal forests. Great iron frames, wheels with carefully filed teeth, long rods and levers, weights hanging on ropes. The escapement, a device that allowed the gear train to advance one tooth at a time made a regular ticking sound that some people found soothing and others considered a low-level menace. The clock needed winding every day or two. This task fell to the clock keeper, a person with a very specific job description. Climb the tower, haul on the weights, adjust the pendulum or foley it, and occasionally express concern about pigeons. The clock keeper is one of those delightful historical figures who existed everywhere and almost never appears in dramatic retellings. They were paid a small salary or given a modest stipend in grain or wine. Town records sometimes mention them only when something went wrong. The clock having struck 9 at the 8th hour, one council minute complains, we remind Master Hans to attend more closely. It is a quiet scolding, but you can hear the exasperation of people whose meetings ran late because the clock enthusiastically jumped an hour without consulting anyone. Public clocks often came with bells, and bells came with decisions. How many times should we ring for each hour? Should there be a warning bell before important events? Some towns rang a first bell at dawn to tell bakers and laborers to start work, then another bell a little later to signal that the rest of the town could consider getting up. There were bells for curfew when fires had to be damped and taverns theoretically closed. Though taverns and curfews have always had a flexible relationship, there were bells for market opening, for the start of court sessions, for special feasts. If you listened from a small house with thin walls, your day might be subtly divided by a sequence of sounds you never consciously scheduled, but relied on anyway. Architects and patrons took pride in their clock faces. Some were simple circles with Roman numerals. Others were elaborate astronomical clocks showing the phases of the moon, the position of the sun, and, in some cases, the current sign of the zodiac, just in case you wanted to time your errands according to celestial opinion. Many included small automata, wooden or metal figures that moved when the clock struck. Tiny knights jousted, skeletons waved hourglasses, roosters flapped their wings. These miniature performances lasted maybe 10 seconds a day, but took months to build, which is an excellent example of medieval priorities. For all their grandeur, these clocks were, by modern standards, impressively inaccurate. Temperature changes made metal expand and contract, gears wore down. Ropes stretched. The clock might gain or lose several minutes a day. This was corrected periodically by local observation of the sun or stars, or, in some cases, simply by polite argument. If enough people insisted that the clock was wrong, the clockkeeper adjusted it until the complaints reached a pleasantly manageable level. In a sense, time in these towns was at least partly democratic. Reality was what the clock said, but what the clock said could be nudged by collective grumbling. As trade and travel increased, the need for more consistent timekeeping grew. Merchants coordinating deliveries between cities started to notice that mid-morning could mean very different things depending on how ambitious the local clockkeeper was feeling that month. Postal systems tried to introduce timetables, which required not just the existence of time, but its reasonably consistent measurement. The invention of the pendulum clock in the 17th century greatly improved accuracy, reducing the daily error to a few seconds. Towns upgraded their mechanisms, sometimes leaving the old frames in the tower as dignified metal skeletons, like retired civil servants watching their successors work. With increasing precision came a new feature, the minute hand. At first, not every clock had one. Many people did not see the point. What, realistically, were you going to do with information accurate to the minute? But gradually, as institutional schedules tightened, minute hands appeared and then multiplied, like slightly bossy eyebrows on the faces of buildings. And once people could see minutes, they began to feel them. Being a few minutes late became a meaningful concept instead of a vague, shrugged sensation. The 19th century brought railways, and with them, a new level of temporal discipline. Trains needed strict timetables. Timetables needed standardized time. Previously, each town had essentially kept its own local solar time, adjusted for longitude. This was fine when journeys were slow, but a fast train could cross several local time zones in a single afternoon, confusing passengers and conductors alike. The solution was railway time, and later National Standard Time, a single time for an entire region based on a reference meridian. Public clocks, which had once embodied local habit, now had to submit to the authority of the National Railway Schedule. Some were connected to telegraph signals, allowing a central observatory to send out a daily pulse that reset clocks across a broad area. The relationship between town and time shifted. Instead of the clock reflecting the town's sense of when things should happen, the town adapted itself to the clock. This insistence that the express train would leave at 10:07, whether your eggs were finished or not. Inside the towers, maintenance routines became more standardized. Manuals advised clockkeepers exactly how often to oil pivots, how to clean gears without leaving lint, how to adjust pendulum lengths for temperature variation. There were even recommended attitudes: careful, patient, and not overly inventive. A clockkeeper with too much creativity could cause more trouble than one who merely forgot to wind the mechanism. Town councils, having learned from centuries of minor complaints, appreciated clockkeepers who treated time as a sturdy, slightly boring garden to be weeded regularly rather than a canvas for personal expression. Still, the human element persisted. Stories survive of clock keepers who subtly shifted their clocks to accommodate local habits. One town infamous for late risers allegedly had a clock that ran 5 minutes slow, giving its inhabitants the illusion of punctuality. Another community's clock keeper, annoyed by constant requests to ring the bell a little early for certain festivities, adopted a strict policy. The clock would follow astronomical time, and if anyone wanted extra celebration, they could simply enjoy feeling ahead of the universe for an hour. It is unclear how effective this was, but it does suggest that even in a highly structured world, time remains slightly negotiable. By the 20th century, wristwatches and home clocks spread widely. Public clocks lost some of their monopoly on telling the time, but not their symbolic weight. They became landmarks, meeting points, and reassuring background presences. "Let's meet under the clock" is a phrase that appears in many diaries and letters, quietly anchoring human connections to a piece of municipal machinery. When people wrote that someone kept them waiting under the town clock for half an hour, we can now imagine the small drama. Glancing up every few minutes, watching the hands crawl, listening to the metallic tick inside the tower, while pigeons rearrange themselves on the ledges. In some cities, public clocks acquired technological helpers. Electric motors replaced weights, radio signals adjusted the time automatically. Digital displays appeared in train stations, counting down minutes and seconds with unblinking certainty. Yet the old tower clocks often continued to function alongside these newer systems. Their bells still rang, sometimes a little after the precise electronic moment, adding a leisurely echo to the exact second. In that small delay, you can hear centuries of less hurried timing, when the bell's purpose was not to synchronize commuters, but simply to say, in effect, the day is passing. Perhaps we should notice. From a sleepy perspective, the most charming part of this history is how much effort went into managing something that, from a cosmic angle, barely exists. We built towers, forged gears, drafted regulations, wrote court cases, and trained specialists, all so that we could agree that it was now 9 o'clock and not, say, an undefined mid-morning-ish blur. We argued about whether the clock should be repainted, whether the bell was too loud, whether the mechanism deserved a more modern escapement, while the stars continued to rise and set with a polite indifference to our scheduling debates. If you imagine now a quiet evening in a town with an old mechanical clock, the scene is unhurried. The shops are closing, shutters creak, lamps flicker on. In the tower, the clock ticks steadily, its pendulum swinging with calm insistence. Every so often, the escapement releases a tooth, a weight descends imperceptibly, and the minute hand creeps forward. At the appointed hour, the striking mechanism engages. A hammer rises and falls against the bell, sending sound out across rooftops and chimneys and clotheslines, where laundry is slowly cooling in the night air. Some people listen and count the strokes. Others barely notice, their minds already tangled in the day's concerns or pleasantly empty. For someone lying awake in a small room, the bell is both a marker and a lullaby. "It's only 10, it says. There is still time to fall asleep. The clock has no idea that it's carefully measured. Announcement is being used as a reassurance rather than a command, but that is one of the gentle misuses of technology that history rarely records, and yet happens constantly. The paperwork that tracks all this, the contracts with clockmakers, the municipal minutes authorizing repairs, the letters from citizens complaining that the clock is wrong again, sits quietly in archives now. Scholars read them to reconstruct timelines, to understand civic pride, to trace technological change. But there is another way to experience this history, simply by noticing how, even today, we glance at public clocks for confirmation, even when our phones already know the time to the millisecond. It is a habit inherited from centuries when that tower dial was the final authority. Eventually, of course, every clock needs maintenance. The mechanism is stopped, the hands are set to noon. Scaffolding appears. For a few days or weeks, the town lives without its familiar strikes. People remark on the silence. Some enjoy it. Others feel oddly untethered, as if the sky has forgotten to tick. When the clock comes back to life, freshly adjusted, the first bell often seems slightly too loud or slightly out of place until everyone remembers, again, how to fold its slow, regular voice into the background of their lives. And somewhere in that rhythm tick, pause, tick bell, there is room for sleep. The history of public clocks is really a long, measured exhalation, dividing our days into manageable blocks so that we don't have to think about the whole span at once. As the hands continue their patient walk around the dial, you can let your thoughts wander just as slowly, from monasteries to tower bells to railway timetables to the small clock on your bedside table. The minutes slip by, gently numbered but not demanding, until eventually you are no longer counting them, and the only schedule that matters is the quiet one your breathing keeps, all on its own. You might not think that a small wooden booth at the end of a bridge, staffed by someone whose main talents were owning a ledger and not falling asleep, could shape how people imagine distance. But for a long time in Europe, a journey was not measured just in miles or days. It was measured in how many times you had to stop, pull out your purse, and pay a quiet little fee, so that both you and your cartwheels were officially allowed to pass from one bank of a river to the other. The medieval toll bridge is one of those institutions that sat in the background of history, endlessly repeating the same tiny drama. Step up, pay, cross, forget, repeat. If you are still awake by the time we get to the regulations on how many chickens count as one load, you are absolutely welcome to subscribe, follow, or simply give a small mental nod to your favorite bridge, but please do not feel obliged. The medieval toll system is perfectly capable of putting you to sleep without any help from you at all. Imagine approaching a town in the 14th century. The road narrows, then rises. Ahead, a stone or timber bridge stretches over a river that has moods, floods, and the occasional opinion about wagons. At the bridgehead stands a little house or shed, sometimes stone, sometimes just sturdy wooden box with a roof that is slightly too small for comfort. This is the toll house. It might have a tiny window like a squinting eye, a door that sticks in damp weather, and a bench worn shiny by decades of toll keepers and their cloaks. Outside, a post or signboard displays the tariff. So many pennies per cart, half as much for a pack horse, less for a foot traveler, and a carefully negotiated rate for pigs. Pigs are always a problem in history. The right to charge these tolls is called a pontage, from the Latin word for bridge. It is not automatic. A lord, a monastery, or sometimes a town council petitions the king or prince for permission. The argument is simple and repetitive. Rivers are inconvenient. Bridges are expensive. Someone has to pay. We would like it to be everyone else, very slowly. The grant often comes back with a time limit, 7 years, say, or 20 on the theory that the toll will be collected only until the cost of building or repairing the bridge is recouped. This theory is optimistic. Tolls, once created, develop attachments. Charters are renewed and renewed again, until the original repairs are a distant rumor and the right to collect a halfpenny from each overloaded cart has turned into a hereditary family asset. The construction of the bridge itself is usually described in fewer words than the tolls. The records might say a stone bridge of 3 arches, or a timber bridge with piles driven into the bed of the river. Occasionally we get glimpses of the work, carpenters shaping beams that will never be seen from the town, masons lowering great blocks of stone into water that rushes around their boots, laborers hauling gravel, lime, and sand in endless trips. Somewhere in the background, someone calculates how many carts of stone can cross each day without making the bridge sulk. These calculations are approximate and based on a unit of measurement that's translated as a sensible amount. When the bridge opens, there is sometimes a little ceremony. A priest sprinkles holy water, Important people walk across with symbolic solemnity, as if testing the patience of the river. Then on the very next morning, a more practical ritual begins. The tollkeeper takes his place, opens his ledger, and waits for the first impatient donkey of the day. The river is now officially monetized. The daily life of a tollkeeper is as repetitive as it is essential. At dawn, or earlier in summer when farmers like to pretend the sun works for them personally, the tollkeeper unlocks the booth and checks the weights and coins. There might be a set of touch pieces, model coins of the correct weight and metal kept in a small bag or box. These serve as a reference in case anyone tries to pay with something suspiciously light or perhaps carved from lead during a creative evening. The tollkeeper straightens the rate board, or if the board is carved in stone, he merely glances at it in the resigned way. One glances at a list of rules everyone has already memorized, but still argues about. Traffic comes in waves. In the early morning, carts piled high with produce rumble over the planks or stones. The toll is sometimes charged by the cart, sometimes by the wheel, sometimes by the load. There are delightful phrases in old documents like a cart with 2 wheels and no more, or 1 horse or beast bearing, burdens with or without panniers, written by clerks who clearly did not trust their future readers to understand what a cart was. People pay with coins, with credit noted in a separate column, or, in some cases, with labor, a day spent repairing the roadway in lieu of ready money. The tollkeeper asks routine questions in a steady tone. Where are you coming from? What are you carrying? Are those barrels really all full of apples, or are some of them quietly filled with wine? The answers matter because certain goods are taxed differently. Wine, for instance, is often subject to special duties. Salt, iron, and cloth also enjoy their own categories of fiscal attention. There's always a temptation to describe one's load more generically. Just barrels, a traveler might say, hoping the tollkeeper is as sleepy as they are. The tollkeeper has heard this before. He taps the side of a barrel, listens for the answering slosh, and adjusts the fee with the small satisfaction of someone who has not been outwitted before breakfast. On some bridges, there is a physical barrier, a chain across the way, a hinged beam, or a gate that can be lowered. This is the literal embodiment of paywall. Until the toll is handed over, the road is quite simply blocked. The sound of the chain being lowered becomes part of the bridge's soundtrack, along with the clatter of hooves, the creak of wheels, and the occasional expression of rural vocabulary when a cart's back wheel decides to have an opinion about the edge of the parapet. Not everyone pays the same toll. Certain individuals and groups have exemptions, each carefully recorded in charters, and then just as carefully interpreted. Clergy on official business might pass free. Messengers carrying royal letters or town records often present a token showing that they are to be admitted without charge. Locals sometimes negotiate reduced rates, arguing that the bridge is, in some moral sense, theirs. Long, polite arguments can arise over the status of a particular traveler. Is this merchant really a messenger, just because his cart happens to be traveling in the same direction as a letter? These disputes are rarely dramatic, but they are deeply felt. After all, in a world where margins are tight, a toll saved is a toll earned. Every so often, traveling dignitaries inspire temporary adjustments. When an important lord or prince passes over the bridge with a glittering retinue, it is considered unwise to stop the procession to demand a halfpenny per horse. Instead, the tollkeeper may later send a carefully written note to the lord's treasurer, listing the number of animals and wagons and gently suggesting a lump sum payment. Whether this payment ever arrives is a question that the surviving records sometimes answer with a silence so complete it might as well be a sigh. At the end of the day, the tollkeeper counts coin. There might be a small scale for weighing larger amounts of money or for checking suspect pieces. Candles burn low as figures are entered into the ledger. So many carts, so many animals, so many foot travelers. Occasionally, an odd note appears. One juggler with monkey, no toll taken, for the entertainment of the keeper. A pilgrim with no coin, allowed to pass on the charity of the bridge. These small exceptions break the monotony and hint at the human texture of the road. Then the booth is shut, the chain is lifted for the night, and the river resumes the indifferent business of flowing. Over time, toll bridges accumulate stories of abuse and reform. Some toll keepers are accused of charging too much or of pocketing a portion of the receipts. Others are suspected, more subtly, of fixing the scale so that loads always weigh just a little heavier than they ought to. Town councils respond with regulations that read like politely exasperated parent letters. The weights are to be inspected monthly. The toll house door is to be left open during the day so that citizens may satisfy themselves that no secret toll is being levied. Complaints must be lodged in writing. One can almost hear the sighs of future historians reading yet another decree that says, in essence, we really mean it this time. On the other side of the ledger, travelers complain as well. Petitions survive in which merchants argue that the toll is excessive, that the bridge was repaired years ago, that the road on the far bank is still muddy, or that there is a perfectly good ford upstream that nature herself provides for free. Sometimes this argument succeed. A crown or prince may rule that a toll should be reduced or abolished. In other cases, nothing changes except the ink on the page and the lingering feeling of having written a very polite letter into the void. Rivers, of course, do not read charters. They flood when they wish. A great flood might damage, or even sweep away a bridge, leaving the toll keeper abruptly unemployed and giving the toll house an unscheduled opportunity to test its buoyancy. Reconstruction begins, sometimes with new petitions for pontage, and the cycle repeats. Occasionally, the replacement bridge is of a different style stone where timber once stood, or vice versa. Old piers may remain as strange stumps in the water, attracting fish, moss, and occasional philosophical reflection. As centuries pass, technology changes, roads are improved. Carts become heavier, wagons acquire iron-bound wheels. The original toll rates, set when a load, meant a modest stack of sacks and barrels, now face vehicles that align more with the spiritual energy of a small barn. New regulations attempt to keep up, special charges for especially heavy wagons, extra fees for loads that might damage the surface, prohibitions against dragging logs directly on the roadway. Somewhere in these lists of rules, we glimpse a recurring worry. The bridge, like a tired mule, must not be asked to carry more than it can bear. Eventually, in many places, the tolls are abolished. Governments decide that bridges are part of the public infrastructure to be supported by general taxes rather than individual payments. One by one, the toll booths close. Some are torn down. Others are converted into small houses, shops, or municipal offices. A few survive as tiny museums, displaying old ledgers, scales, and toll boards with fading lettering. Visitors look at these objects with the faint curiosity one reserves for artifacts that clearly mattered to someone once, in a way that is now difficult to feel. Even when the tolls are gone, the logic of the bridge still shapes movement. The river narrows here, the road crosses here. The town has grown up around this point. Old toll houses sometimes remain as architectural punctuation, marking where people used to pause, count their coins, and think very briefly about the value of the journey they were making. You might cross such a bridge today, headphones in, half listening to something perhaps, say a very sleepy historical narration, and never notice the tiny building on the side. Yet it once collected, day after day, the small acknowledgments of thousands of footsteps and wheels. If you let your mind drift backward as you imagine crossing, the scene fills in almost by itself. Ahead, a line of carts waits. Somewhere, a mule snorts. The toll keeper leans in the doorway of the booth, ledger in hand. A gust of wind smells of river water and cabbage. The signboard creaks. The sky is the color of unambitious parchment. Each traveler steps up, pays, and moves on. Nothing extraordinary happens, and yet the records pile up in neat bundles, wrapped in twine, stored in chests. Row after row of entries, dates, names, amounts. An entire world reduced to columns of numbers that, together, kept stone arches from sinking and wooden planks from splintering. This is what much of history looks like when you zoom in close and stay there. Not great battles, but quiet exchanges. Not kings and queens, but the person who had to wake up at dawn because the chain across the bridge would not lower itself. The toll bridge was not glamorous. It rarely appears in paintings except as background, but it was solid, dependable, and endlessly repetitive, like the ticking of a clock or the breathing of someone almost asleep. As you listen, you can let the details become pleasantly interchangeable. Another cart, another fee, another line in the ledger. Another winter flood, another repair, another petition. The tollkeeper's handwriting changes after 20 years. A new name appears on the charter. The signboard is repainted in slightly different spelling. The river flows on with exactly the same sound. In that steady, slow sameness, there is something quietly comforting. The world needs its bridges, and someone has to mind them. And as the centuries stretch out like the stone arches themselves, you might feel your own thoughts stepping more slowly, as if queuing at a toll house of their own. One after another, they present themselves, pay their little attention fee, and cross the bridge into sleep, leaving the booth behind. Ledger half open, candle flickering, while the night river moves softly underneath and the road ahead fades into a comfortable, indistinct distance. You might not expect that deciding what to paint on a door could require imperial decrees, police patrols, and the occasional minor riot. But for a surprisingly long time, people managed to live in cities without any house numbers at all, and when governments finally tried to add them, the results were administratively dramatic and visually very small. Tonight, we are going to drift very slowly through the history of how walls acquired little numbers, and how those numbers then needed to be repainted, reorganized, and occasionally argued with. It is one of those stories where almost nothing happens quickly, and yet every street you know is a quiet monument to the paperwork. If you are still awake by the time we reach the part where officials discuss whether the even numbers should be on the left or the right side of the street, you are absolutely welcome to. Subscribe, follow, or simply nod gently in approval. But do not feel any pressure. The history of house numbering works best when you let it wash over you like a very polite census that someone else has to fill out. For a long time, cities relied on description instead of digits. A letter might be addressed to the third house after the fountain, or the house with the red door opposite the inn, or Mr. So-and-so near the church, ask any neighbor. It sounds vague, but in tightly packed medieval neighborhoods, everyone knew everyone else's business and front step. Whim records spoke in the language of neighbors, bounded on the east by the baker's house, on the west by the widow's dwelling. If the baker moved or the widow remarried, the clerk might add a careful note in the margin, like a low-key plot twist. Streets themselves often lacked official names. People referred to them by what happened there: the street where the tanners worked, the street where a fish arrived, the street that always flooded on Thursdays. This system functioned surprisingly well as long as cities grew slowly and strangers were rare. But as armies, merchants, tax collectors, and curious officials began to move around more in the 17th and 18th centuries, the lack of fixed addresses became a practical inconvenience. Soldiers quartered in private homes had to locate the correct families. Tax assessors needed to be sure they had not accidentally skipped the quiet house behind the tree. Police officers could not easily say, "We will visit house number 12," when 12 did not yet exist as a concept on that road. Everyone made do with landmarks, which is romantic until you realize how many houses were plausibly described as next to the market. Early experiments with house numbering were often tied to military logistics. In some towns, when soldiers were billeted among civilians, officials chalked numbers on the doors to keep track of which regiment was lodged where. These numbers were temporary, sometimes washed away by rain or by residents who did not care for the new decoration. Yet they introduced the idea that a house could be identified by a small, neutral symbol rather than by whoever currently owned a memorable goat. One city after another flirted with the idea, then forgot about it, in the way one might try organizing a drawer and then decide it is easier to live in polite chaos. By the mid-18th century, enlightened rulers and city councils began to reconsider. They liked statistics. They liked counts of things. They liked to know who lived where, how many they were, and whether they could be efficiently taxed, conscripted, or simply admired on a chart. House numbers promised a new kind of order, one that could be written in neat columns. So decrees went out, streets were to be surveyed, houses listed, numbers assigned. It all sounded so straightforward on paper. On the ground, of course, people had feelings. In parts of Central Europe, when imperial authorities ordered houses to be numbered, rumors spread that the numbers were a prelude to new taxes, forced conscription, or other unwelcome efficiencies. Some residents erased or altered the painted digits at night, as if confusing the clerk today might confuse the empire forever. Others nailed charms or religious symbols beside the numbers, just in case. A very ordinary scene might appear on a Monday morning. An official with chalk and a list carefully marking each doorway, followed at a discreet distance by a skeptical grandmother with a wet cloth, erasing anything that looked too cooperative. The materials of the numbers were themselves a quiet study in practicality. At first, many cities simply painted them directly on the plaster or stone, in black or red, whichever paint the city warehouse possessed in more generous quantity. The size varied according to the enthusiasm of the painter. Some were large, dramatic statements. Others looked like shy afterthoughts. Rain, soot, and the occasional bored child with a stick wore them away, so cities experimented with nailed-on metal plates, ceramic tiles, or small carved stones. In some neighborhoods, you can still see layers of history, a faded painted number, a later iron plate screwed and slightly crooked, and a modern reflective sign added by a fire safety inspector with a clipboard and firm opinions. Numbering schemes themselves became miniature philosophies. Some towns chose a continuous sequence, starting at one end of a street and assigning numbers upwards until the other end. When new houses were built in the middle, the sequence developed awkward gaps, like someone trying to insert extra books into a perfectly arranged shelf. Neighbors might find themselves living at 12 and 12 and a half, or at 14A and 14B, or in moments of clerical creativity at 14 and 14 second. Other cities preferred the horseshoe system, numbering all the way down one side and back up the other in a single spiral. This made a nice visual pattern on a map, but it required visitors to intuit where the invisible loop began. Gradually, the even-odd system emerged as a favorite. One side of the street would carry even numbers, the other odd, marching in opposite rows. It looked orderly on survey plans and let people deduce location from a number alone. There are recorded arguments about which side deserved the even numbers. Some officials felt strongly that even had a dignified, symmetrical air, and therefore belonged on the side with grander houses. Others saw no reason at all and flipped a coin, thereby affecting future directions like it's on the even side for centuries. It is possible as you fall asleep to imagine a very small committee leaning over a map, debating whether the side with the bakery should be odd or even, and then going home with a sense of an oddly specific day's work. House numbers were not purely bureaucratic tools. They seeped slowly into everyday speech. Residents would start to say, "We live at number 7, instead of "Our house is by the fountain." Shopkeepers painted their numbers larger and clearer, hoping customers would remember them. Some numbers acquired reputations. Corner houses proudly emphasized their one, while landlords quietly reassured prospective tenants that number 13 was, in their opinion, just another integer with slightly misunderstood vibes. In some districts, people insisted on using both systems at once, giving directions like the third house after the well, which is also number 24, but no one calls it that. Of course, once numbers existed, they needed maintenance. Cities frequently reorganized streets, cut new openings, or merged old lanes. Whenever this happened, the numbering had to be redone. Clerks approached this task with elaborate seriousness. Should the old numbers be kept, with new houses squeezed in as 16A, 16B, and 16C, like footnotes on a busy page? Or should the entire street be renumbered from scratch, risking confusion but promising elegance? Regulations were written to prevent excessive multiplication of letters, which is a very bureaucratic way of saying that someone believed 2-4 did was perhaps too much. Renumbering days were like small civic rituals. Officials walked the street with lists, workers climbed ladders to change plates. Neighbors compared their old addresses with their new ones and speculated about whether the move from 12 to 32 signaled any deeper cosmic revaluation. In some cities, house numbering intersected with religious or cultural habits in unexpected ways. For example, in neighborhoods where people traditionally chalked seasonal blessings on doorways, the numbers had to find a respectful place nearby. The result was a layered doorway, sacred letters above, municipal digits below, each with its own jurisdiction. Elsewhere, landlords tried briefly to market houses by emphasizing lucky numbers. Those statistics grimly suggest that the main effect of such efforts was to give surveyors more reasons to sigh. Visitors from the countryside sometimes found numbered streets unsettling. Used to describing farmsteads by names, the Oaks, the Mill, the Lower Meadow, they entered cities where houses seemed reduced to simple counts. Travel diaries note the novelty. Each door bears a number so that one may, it is said, find a dwelling without inquiry. The writers often add a faint note of disbelief, as if depending on numerals instead of local gossip might be a little impersonal. Yet the new system worked. Couriers delivered letters more accurately. Officials compiled more reliable censuses. Lost travelers could be redirected with minimal hand-waving. The city quietly became legible. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, cabinets filled with address books. These early directories listed inhabitants street by street with their corresponding numbers. Some were published for public use. Others slumbered in municipal offices, consulted by clerks whenever an obscure regulation required knowing exactly who lived at number 43. As years passed, names on these lists changed while numbers stayed mostly the same. The digits became a kind of skeleton for the neighborhood, supporting generations of shifting stories without telling any one of them too loudly. Naturally, mistakes crept in. Two houses might accidentally be given the same number during a hurried renumbering. A dead-end alley might be forgotten entirely, leaving its residents in an unofficial limbo, living between numbers, which sounds more poetic than it felt when the post went astray. Periodic surveys corrected these anomalies, but not always perfectly. When modern utilities and postal services arrived, they inherited these small confusions and added a few of their own. Somewhere, probably right now, a patient employee is investigating why one address is officially 18B, locally known as 20.5, and appears in the electricity company's registry as 19 with courtyard. From time to time, reformers called for rationalization. They proposed standardized plate sizes, uniform colors, and nationally consistent rules. Some countries adopted such schemes. Others allowed a controlled chaos to persist, so that you can walk down a single European street today and see ceramic tiles, enameled metal, painted wood, and carved stone, all calmly insisting that they are, in fact, number 9. Emergency services eventually had the strongest opinions, arguing that a clear, well-placed number could save lives. And so, in many places, the humble house number acquired one final upgrade, reflective materials, standardized fonts, possibly even illumination. The digits that began as chalk scribbles by suspicious clerks now glow gently in the dark, ready for anyone who needs to find them. If you glance around the room you are in right now, you might not see any numbers at all. They are usually outside, facing the street, performing their quiet duty for strangers rather than for the people who live with them every day. But you probably still know your address by heart, the sequence of street name and number that drops you, as if by spell, onto one particular patch of the planet. Behind that sequence lies a long history of walking officials, drying paint, cautious neighbors, and lists written in precise handwriting. As your eyelids grow heavier, you can imagine one such official, centuries ago, pacing down a cobbled street with a brush in hand. He stops at each doorway, consults his paper, and paints a number with slow strokes. The air smells of lime wash and distant cooking. Children watch from windows. A dog, unconcerned with numerical innovations, naps exactly where carts mean to pass. The official moves on, 13, 15, 17. The numbers line up like notes on a very quiet scale. By the time he reaches the end of the street, nothing dramatic has happened. No battle, no coronation, no thunderclap. Only a row of houses that are now, for the first time, part of a simple sequence. Years later, people will use those numbers without thinking. Letters will arrive correctly. Deliveries will find their door. And somewhere in an archive, the original list that matched each house to its new identity will gather dust. Its ink slowly fading, but its work already done. You can let your thoughts step along that same street, counting gently as they go until the numbers themselves blur and soften. One more doorway. One more small digit in paint or stone. One more unremarkable detail in the long, quiet effort to make the world slightly easier to navigate, even in the dark. And as the street drifts away and the numbers recede into a comfortable haze, you may find that your own sense of place has narrowed down to a single point: the bed where you are, the room around you, and the soft idea that somewhere outside, a little metal plate is patiently telling the night exactly where you live, so that you no longer need to think about it at all. You might not think that the small bent wire on your desk has a history, but it does, and it is longer than you probably want to stay awake for. The humble paperclip, that little loop of steel that refuses to be dramatic, took centuries to arrive at its current quietly competent shape. It has been redesigned, renamed, worshipped in patent offices, and occasionally promoted to the rank of improvised tool. But mostly it has done the same thing over and over: hold 2 or 3 pieces of paper together until someone forgets why they were clipped in the first place. Tonight we are going to wander very slowly through that history, one sheet at a time, until the papers and your thoughts drift out of order in a pleasantly sleepy way. If you are somehow still awake when we reach the part about regional standards for wire gauge and mid-20th century filing systems, you have my full permission to subscribe or follow or do whatever small digital gesture of appreciation seems least tiring. But truly, this is a story designed to make you relax. The paperclip will not mind if you fall asleep in the middle. It has been ignored on desks for more than 100 years. It is extremely used to being unappreciated. Before there were paper clips, there were pins, ribbons, wax, and hope. Medieval clerks kept pages together by sewing them with thread through the corner, a commitment level that suggests they did not anticipate frequent resorting. Later, as paper became cheaper and piles became thicker, people tried stabbing documents with straight pens. If you imagine a stack of petitions held together by tiny metal spears, you will not be surprised to learn that this method occasionally drew blood and often tore the paper. Some particularly cautious writers used ribbon tie systems, a hole in each sheet, a bit of string, a careful bow. It worked, but it turned every small memo into a tiny shoelace project. In some archives, you can still see the old holes, empty now, like healed piercings in the history of stationery. The arrival of industrial-made steel wire in the 19th century opened new possibilities for fastening things that did not want to stay fastened. Wire was springy, cheap, and could be bent into shapes that politely insisted on their own elasticity. Inventors began tinkering. They produced devices with names like paper fastener, binder, and clip, many of which looked like miniature traps for extremely unwary mice. Some used screws, others sharp teeth. Some required special pliers to open and close. It was as if everyone agreed that paper needed to be temporarily attached, but nobody agreed that this should be easy. In the 1890s, somewhere in this crowded field, a simple double oval design emerged. You probably know it as the standard paperclip shape today, a loop of wire bent into an elongated oval, with the inner loop almost mirroring the outer. This style is often called the gem pattern, after a British company that manufactured it, though no one is quite certain if that company actually invented it or simply produced it enthusiastically. The gem clip did something quietly clever. Instead of piercing the paper, it used friction and spring tension, letting sheets slide between its loops. It was small, flat, and could be applied or removed with the same motion. Most importantly, it did not require instructions. If you put one in the hands of someone who had never seen it before, there was a good chance they would figure out what to do without a training course. This immediately set it apart in the history of office supplies. Because patent law is as fond of complications as the paperclip is of simplicity, many other designs were patented around the same time. There were cloverleaf clips with decorative loops, Niagara clips that looked like wire waterfalls, and earnest variations that added extra curls here and there, presumably to justify their existence. Examining old patent drawings is like leafing through a fashion catalog for tiny pieces of metal that all secretly wish they were the gem. Some inventors tried to claim improved gripping power. Others focused on resisting rust, tingling, or the loss of dignity that occurs when a clip deforms and refuses to spring back. The office supply world, if you look closely, is full of such quiet dramas. Gradually, however, the gem won by doing almost nothing fancy at all. It stacked nicely in boxes. It did not snag easily on clothing. It could be bent back into shape after mild abuse. And it was cheap enough that an entire handful spilled on the floor merely provoked a resigned sigh, not an accounting crisis. By the early 20th century, gem-style paperclips had spread across offices in Europe and North America, like a soft metal language of temporary order. Secretaries and clerks developed their own preferences. Some insisted on shiny nickel-plated clips, others on darker steel that glared less under gaslight. Large clips were for thick reports, small ones for short notes, and there was always at least one mysterious oversized clip on the boss's desk, holding together nothing but his own sense of importance. Once the paperclip colonized the office, it began colonizing the imagination discreetly. Instruction manuals started to mention it in passing. Attach the receipt to the invoice with a paperclip, they would say, as if this tiny act was now self-evident. Business schools taught filing systems that assumed the presence of clips. Metal wire was sliced, bent, packaged, shipped, and spilled at a rate that would have impressed any blacksmith from earlier centuries. There were jokes about how many paper clips could be swallowed by a messy desk. Nobody kept exact counts, but you can be fairly sure the number is somewhere between a surprising amount and all of them. In everyday use, the clip's personality emerged. It quietly tolerated misuse, turned into an impromptu tool for pressing calculator reset buttons, picking crumbs out of keyboard keys, or, in moments of boredom, being bent and unbent until it could no longer remember its original purpose. Teachers used clips as makeshift hooks for temporary displays. Office workers twisted them into miniature sculptures during long meetings, creating wire animals and abstract shapes that were eventually pressed back into service around a memo. The paperclip became the office equivalent of fidgeting, something to manipulate gently while the serious part of the brain pretended to pay full attention. The Second World War brought the paperclip one of its rare moments of symbolic fame. In occupied Norway, people quietly wore paperclips on their lapels as a sign of resistance and unity. The clip, which normally expressed nothing more than "these pages belong together for now," briefly stood for something much larger: people holding together under pressure. It is one of the few times a piece of stationery managed to moonlight as political jewelry. Still, even here, the symbolism was modest, almost shy. A paperclip is easily overlooked. That was part of the point. After the war, paperclips settled back into their natural habitat: desks, drawers, and cardboard boxes that say 100 paperclips in fonts that somehow already feel tired. Office design modernized around them. Filing cabinets, those upright metal wardrobes of bureaucracy, grew deeper to accommodate thicker folders, each stuffed with sheaves of clipped documents. A good paperclip needed to be strong enough to keep a report together while it was shuttled from in-tray to out-tray, yet flexible enough to let someone disassemble the stack when revising page 4. Clips traveled in inter-office envelopes, clinging politely to annexes and appendices. Some of them vanished en route, possibly falling into that mysterious second ecosystem of offices, the space behind the photocopier where dust, old staples, and lost stationery go to contemplate the futility of human filing. As technology evolved, the paperclip persisted by doing what it had always done. Typewriters gave way to computers, but printed drafts still needed temporary assembly. Even as email took over a large part of communication, projects that reached a certain seriousness often emerged on paper for review, each section clipped to its neighbors with the calm assurance of someone who has seen formats come and go. The clip is not offended when its services are no longer needed. It simply slides off and waits to be reused, which is more than can be said for some software. Interestingly, the digital world borrowed the silhouette of the paperclip as a universal symbol for attachment. In your email client, a tiny stylized clip appears to indicate that another file is tucked inside. This is not how attachments actually work in the mysterious depths of servers and protocols, but the metaphor is comforting. It suggests that your document is not floating alone in the invisible ether, but is safely secured, as if by a small piece of bent wire. Many people click that icon every day without reflecting that it was once a literal object, sitting in a dusty dish on a secretary's desk, waiting to pinch two pieces of paper together. The physical clip has become a kind of ghost in the interface, continuing to do symbolic work long after the actual pile of printed memos has shrunk. Of course, not all paper clips are created equal. Office supply catalogs quietly list variations, coded clips in bright colors, designed to signal urgency. Nuns get clips with small serrations, meant to grip more tightly. Jumbo clips for thick stacks, tiny clips for delicate papers. There are even triangular clips that claim to reduce crimping, and half-length clips that pride themselves on economy of metal. Somewhere, there is almost certainly an argument about which style bends least under stress, and which is more aesthetically pleasing on a quarterly report. These debates rarely leave the break room, but they are part of the paperclip's ongoing social life. From time to time, artists and educators rescue clips from anonymity. Classroom experiments use them to teach probability chain building, or the surprising strength of interlocking loops. Sculptors sometimes construct huge chains or spheres from thousands of clips, turning the most ordinary object in the drawer into something monumental. Museums and public squares in a few places even display giant paperclip statues, enlarged many times over, commemorating that Norwegian resistance symbol or simply celebrating the design itself. It is hard not to smile at the idea of driving past a 20-foot-tall stainless steel clip and thinking, yes, that is exactly the right size for the planet's paperwork. Yet for every celebrated clip, there are countless others doing quiet work. In archives and basements, Paper clips hold together old letters, receipts, and notes that no one has glanced at in years. Archivists who worry professionally about the future sometimes consider the long-term effects of these metal guardians. Over decades, certain metals can rust and leave faint ghosts on the paper. Sometimes the clips are carefully removed and replaced with archival-friendly alternatives, like plastic or specially coated metal. The old clips are then stored separately in clear bags, as if they too deserve preservation for having clung so faithfully to their charges. It is a tender kind of bureaucracy where even the tools of order are cataloged and boxed. When you look closely at a paper clip, you might notice how economical it is. One piece of wire, bent in 3 main curves, provides 2 layers of tension. The inner loop presses the paper against the outer loop. The ends are safely tucked in so they do not scratch. There is no hinge to break, no spring to crack, no small screw to lose. It is an object that has reached the design plateau known as good enough, where further innovation is possible but rarely necessary. Designers occasionally propose radically new fastening systems, but in everyday life, the simple clip remains the default choice for, I will need to separate these things again later, but not right now. Meanwhile, in your own environment, paper clips probably wander. They migrate from documents to drawers, from drawers to pockets, from pockets to the small bowl near the front door where coins and keys gather. 1 or 2 might be hiding in the lining of your bag, waiting to poke your fingers gently during an unrelated search. If you gather them, they form a small, cool handful of metal, light but oddly dense with implication. Each clip has likely held together several tiny episodes of your life. Forms for school, printed tickets, receipts from a trip, pages from a long-forgotten project. Separately, none of these moments seem important. Together, they form a quiet record of paperwork that once felt urgent and now does not. As the world moves further into digital systems, people occasionally predict the end of the paperclip. There will be no more paper, they say, and therefore nothing to clip. This may eventually be true. Yet for now, printers still hum, envelopes still arrive, and a surprising number of official processes still ask you to attach supporting documents in the old physical sense. For every grand statement about the paperless office, there is a modest clip waiting to prove that rumors of its retirement are exaggerated. It is in no hurry to disappear. Its whole personality is unhurried. So as you lie there and your thoughts begin to loosen like pages sliding from a file, you can imagine a single paperclip resting on a desk at the end of the day. The office lights are dimmed. The hum of machines has faded. The clip is still, its curves catching a trace of reflected light from a street lamp outside. Nearby, a small stack of papers waits to be sorted tomorrow. Maybe they will be important, maybe they will not. The clip will take them on without judgment. One by one, those pages will be gathered, aligned with a little tap on the desk, and then the clip will glide over the corner, embracing them with just enough force to keep them together, not so much as to leave a mark. It has done this thousands of times and will do it thousands more, as long as there are still people who prefer a small physical reassurance that things belong together. You can let your breathing follow that motion, papers straightened, edges aligned, wires sliding into place, in and out. Hold and release. Somewhere across offices and kitchens and quiet home desks, millions of paper clips are resting right now, waiting for tomorrow's small tasks. They are not heroic. They are not urgent. They are, in the best possible way, boring. And in their boring patience, in their gentle insistence on temporarily holding chaos in neat little stacks, they offer a kind of comfort that does not demand attention. As your eyes grow heavier, imagine those loops of wire becoming softer, blurring at the edges, until they are no longer objects, but just shapes smooth and continuous like the outline of a thought as it curls once, twice, and then lets go. The papers drift apart in your mind, fluttering down into a quiet, unnumbered pile, and the last little clip with nothing. Left to do, simply rest there still and content as the rest of the world becomes pleasantly out of focus.